Hello, everyone, and greetings from Down Under. I'm extremely excited to be here today, especially with this lineup of exceptional nutrition scientists that are speaking alongside me. It's a real pleasure, so thank you so much for the invitation. In my talk, I'm going to be discussing what is a balanced carbohydrate, and then discuss the associations of the balanced carbohydrate with dietary intake in the Australian context. Now, if you're kind of expecting an Aussie accent, I'm so sorry. It's not going to happen. It's a mixture of accents. I'm actually Brazilian, Canadian, and Australian. But with that, I can give you some insights and perspectives from 3 different continents on the science that we're presenting, but also its implications. Before we begin, here are my disclosures. For this project specifically, we received a research grant from Nestlé Rsearch. Well, there's really no scientific consensus on how to best measure carbohydrate quality. We know that several markers exist, and these include, just for a quick recap, obviously glycemic index, glycemic load, whole grains, and dietary fiber that are often used in the literature. The issue is that these markers differ in how accurately they represent a high-quality food choice. And they may or may not be understood by consumers as well, but that's a whole nother area. So how should we go about assessing carbohydrate quality? Well, research from Lisa's group in New Zealand that I'm presenting here, published in the Lancet just last year, they conducted a series of systematic literature reviews and meta-analyses. So these were from both cohort and RCT evidence, focusing on the population as a whole, and specifically those without chronic disease. So they showed that the best certainty in the evidence, or the highest grade, was for dietary fiber, and it ranged between 25 to 29 grams as the recommendation per day, and this was supported by both cohort and RCT evidence. The relationship between whole grain and health was graded as low to moderate, and GI and GL metrics was very low to low. Now, the effect of GI specifically tends to be modest, even though it's quite significant when you compare it to fiber on whole grain. And we know that whole grain, generally, there seems to be a good correlation between whole grain and dietary fiber. So using fiber specifically as a carbohydrate quality marker makes sense because it also takes into account a range of other foods like fruits and vegetables, where whole grains may be specifically to grain foods only. So developing an alternative metric that takes dietary fiber into account seems to be important. So first, let's look at the relation between both dietary fiber and free sugars and health. We know that there's compelling evidence for fiber and health outcomes. There's actually over 100 years of evidence in this area. We know that dietary fiber is associated with positive gut health, lowering cholesterol levels, and also blood sugar control. Free sugars, on the other hand, we know that excessive free sugar consumption is associated with poor health outcomes. And these include increased body weight and obesity, dental caries, cardiovascular diseases, and also metabolic disorders. So the World Health Organization recommends certain targets for the population on both. And these are greater than 25 grams per day of dietary fiber, and less than 10% of daily energy intake coming from free sugars. But we know, and this is not unique to Australia, we know that disparities exist between those dietary recommendations or targets and what people are actually consuming. In Australia, Australians are not meeting either targets. So with the adequate intake, we just published a couple of years ago on this, and only 28% are actually meeting the adequate intake target, which is quite generous. If you look at other targets like the suggested dietary targets in Australia, it's even higher at 28 grams for females and 38 grams for males. So very, very few people are actually meeting dietary fiber intake, which is not surprising given like 99% of children aren't eating enough vegetables and a high percentage aren't even eating enough fruit as well. So in terms of free sugars, 47% of men and 44% of women are exceeding targets. Again, this is based on the 10% of energy intake using usual intake of free sugars. from nationally representative samples in Australia. So that's our Australian health survey data set. And if you use the more strict target from the WHO of 5%, then over 85% are not meeting. So we know there's a good 40% or so between that 5 to 10%, which is promising. But again, most people are not meeting either target. So there's a huge public health need to help improve carbohydrate quality in the Australian context. So the question is, how do we find the right balance and determine which carbohydrate-rich foods are beneficial for health? Well, the obvious issue is that if you look at foods higher in fiber, some foods are high in fiber, but they're also higher in free sugars. And these include things like your bran muffins, some whole grain, higher fiber muesli bars, and breakfast cereals that can be both a source of free sugars and fiber, like granolas. On the other hand, if you just look at free sugars, then products and foods can be lower in free sugars, but they can also be lower in fiber, and that's often what we see. So for example, in this case, your plain crackers, white rice, and a lower sugar breakfast cereal. So how do we actually find the right balance? And the right balance can be found using a carbohydrate quality ratio. So there's research showing that a ratio of 10 grams of carbohydrate for a minimum of 1 gram of fiber, or a 10-to-1 ratio, has been linked to foods that contain high fiber, but also are lower in free sugars, sodium, trans fats, without increasing energy intake, which is important, and have also been linked to decreased risk of type 2 diabetes in adults. This 10-to-1 ratio is actually recommended by the American Heart Association, and it was developed based on the proportion of carbohydrate to fiber that's found in wheat bread. So Dariush Mozaffarian's group from Tufts University's Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, a mouthful, they have proposed this 10-to-1 ratio alongside two other balanced carbohydrate ratio to help identify products that are higher in nutritional quality. So Dariush will be presenting next on this topic, but I'll give you an overview and make his job a bit easier by explaining these ratios, which we also used. So the ratios from Dariush's group have just been published, and it's just hot off the press. So for simplicity purposes, we've named these ratios to make it easier for us to talk about them. So this first ratio is called the simple ratio. And then the other two ratios were the 10-to-1, and then adding a free sugars constraint to the 10-to-1 is the 10-to-1 to 2. So in this case, it's 10 grams of carbohydrate for a minimum of 1 gram of fiber, but also a maximum of 2 grams of free sugars. We're calling this the modified ratio. And the third ratio is the 10-to-1 ratio alongside another ratio between fiber and free sugars, which is 1 gram of fiber to a maximum of 2 grams of free sugars. And we're calling this the dual ratio. Now, these ratios have been applied to products, with which Dari will present on, but they haven't been applied to diets, which is what we want to find out. So we wanted to determine how healthy a person's diet is if it's based on a carbohydrate balance. Never been done before, which is pretty exciting for us. So our aims were to determine, are carbohydrate quality ratios that we discussed associated with population nutrient intakes and diet quality? And what is the theoretical impact of substituting carbohydrate foods in someone's diet to meet the ratio in place, substituting the foods that don't meet the ratio for those that meet the ratio, and the effect that it has on both nutrient intakes and diet quality? So what did we do? We used the latest data available in Australia. It's from the Australian National Nutrition and Physical Activity Survey, which is part of the Australian Health Survey. It is old, but it's the best that we have, and it's a large amount of participants from 2 years of age and older. It uses the automated multiple pass 24 dietary recall method to capture all foods and beverages consumed in the last 24 hours, similar to Enhance, using 2 days of recall, where 65% of participants were assessed for dietary intake on another day. So in terms of the ratios, we defined participants as having met or not met each ratio in terms of their total daily nutrient intakes. We then compared those who met the ratio and didn't meet the ratio in terms of their nutrient intakes, but also diet quality. So diet quality was measured using the validated Australian Healthy Eating Index, which is modeled on the AHEI, but modified to the Australian diet to reflect our updated dietary guidelines. So a score is given from 1 to 10 to the following 9 components. So they were the 5 core food groups in the Australian dietary guidelines, discretionary foods and beverages, and saturated fat, added sugars, and sodium. Then a score of 0 to 5 was allocated to the components water and alcohol. The other thing that we did that was unique to our study is the substitution modeling. So we substituted foods that did not satisfy the ratio with the closest food that satisfied the ratio that was similar in the major food groups in the Australian food composition data set, which was part of the Australian Health Survey, on cereals, products, and their dishes. So there are 2 major food groups that are carbohydrate food groups. And within those food groups that are major, you've got sub-major, minor, and then the food level. So what we did is we gave scores to determine how close 2 different foods were. If they were within the same minor food group, which is the highest level of detail, they were given a score of 1. If they were in the same sub-major food group, but different minor food group, they're given a score of 2, and so on. So where possible, we chose foods that were the closest to substitute them. And this is to ensure that the theoretical modeling is realistic, so you're not substituting, for example, a cracker for an apple, for example. So what did we find? We found that the simple ratio was the easiest ratio to meet. You can see here among adults, 50% actually met the simple ratio, 33% met the modified, and 41% met the dual ratio, which makes sense. So the easiest one to meet is the one that doesn't have the free sugars constraint added to it. And surprisingly, we found that children were less likely to meet the ratio than adults, which to me is really concerning because obviously children have a lot less control over their dietary intake and their food choices and availability. So it's disappointing that adults are more likely to meet these ratios than children, especially given the finding of which food groups modified diet quality the most, which I'll come to soon. So it just shows, personally, I've seen how children as young as 1 are consuming very high refined carbohydrate foods that are low in fiber and high free sugars. So I believe that this really is an area that needs consideration and that we have to think about what we offer children with respect to its fiber content and free sugars content. Carbohydrate quality ratios also improve nutrient intakes. So how did the 3 ratios actually fare? You can see here that they're very similar. They all had a similar trend on how they improved nutrient intakes. You can see for all 3, it decreased energy intake, which is what we want. But at the same time, as predicted, by definition, the ratios improved fiber intake, decreased free sugars, and across the board improved micronutrient intakes, with the exception of sodium, which was no different. Now, these data are for adults only, but we found a very similar relationship among children and adolescents. We also found that carbohydrate quality is associated with diet quality. So choosing a balanced carbohydrate ratio or meeting the carbohydrate ratio was associated with greater healthy eating index score. Now, this was across all ratios, but the difference in diet quality was greatest for the dual ratio, with the greatest difference here, 58.2 versus 44.7. But you can see that all ratios performed quite well. The improvement in diet quality was largely increased by servings of fruit and vegetables and decreased servings of discretionary foods, which by definition in Australia, discretionary foods and beverages are those that are high in saturated fat, sodium, and sugars. So it's not surprising we have that improvement. And there were some smaller improvements for grains, for meat, and for the water component. So what happens when you substitute the specific foods that meet the ratios on overall nutrient intakes? And what we found is that modeling to substitute foods to meet the ratio further improved the nutrient intakes, even among participants, obviously, who originally met the ratio. So you can see increased energy, protein, fiber, most B vitamins, magnesium, potassium, and zinc, and decreased total carbohydrates, free sugars, sodium, and B12, with some small differences across the three different ratios. So the fact that energy intake is higher among the modeled population is telling us that carbohydrate foods that do satisfy the ratio tend to have higher energy intake by weight than those that don't. So remember that the substitution models compared the entire population with itself, so modeled versus unmodeled. It doesn't take into account whether a participant met or didn't meet the ratio. So even if they met or didn't meet, we're basically substituting at the food level from those foods in the diet that don't to foods that do. So what are some of the take-home messages, things for you to remember if you've dozed off by now? The main one is that we know that Australians have low carbohydrate quality, with only 1 in 2 meeting the simple ratio. So there's huge room for improvement to improve carbohydrate quality. We also know that Australians aren't meeting either free sugars or dietary fiber targets. We showed from our research that the ratios were associated with not only greater nutrient intakes, but improved diet quality. And that having that free sugars constraint in that dual ratio provided even a greater improvement in diet quality. And also that theoretically substituting carbohydrate foods to meet the ratio improved people's nutrient intakes. Now, what are some considerations and next steps? This is where I want to inspire everyone to think outside the box and think about what impact our research can have. To recap, this is obviously a cross-sectional study. It's nationally representative, large number of participants, so it's the first step for us as nutrition scientists. Knowing that it only applies to Australia as well, Australians generally have a different dietary pattern and a food supply to US, to Canada, to South America. It's very different. Personally, I've seen that difference. But from a research perspective, I've also seen it because I've done quite a bit of research on breakfast cereal intake of Australians. Australians are breakfast cereal consumers. 1 in 2 have it. But 1 in 2 have the breakfast cereal with lower sugars, which is very different to what's happening, for example, in the US, particularly among children. So to give you an example of cultural and product differences, the range of sugar content in breakfast cereals available for purchase in Australia are much lower than the US. The tertiles of sugar intake of breakfast cereals in the survey were much lower. And most children were in the first tertile of low sugar intake. Whereas research from the US is the complete opposite. Most children are in the highest tertile, and that tertile is actually a lot higher than the third tertile in Australia. So not only is consumption patterns different, but also the food supply is different. We also know that more than 80% of products available in supermarkets in Australia have a source of whole grain. So that's really, really important to think and to replicate this research in other countries to see if the trend continues, given some of the differences that exist. Our substitution modeling is also just proof of concept. And obviously you'd want to test that further by, actually doing an intervention. So what are next steps? What can we do in terms of researchers? Obviously, we can start using a carbohydrate quality metric to associate it with more health outcomes, to diet quality index in other populations, in other countries. For industry, obviously, it can help guide them to make food products healthier, perhaps via formulation or reformulation. For the government, it could help with policy development, labeling regulations with respect to the ratios. And for consumers, it might ultimately just help them make healthier food choices and help them guide which foods to consume, especially those that are packaged and processed where there's an NIP. So in terms of next steps, like how can we translate these findings to public health policies and health promotion strategies? Well, we need future research really to study the relationship between these ratios and health outcomes, both in children and in adults. We want to investigate further the foods in a substitution modeling to figure out what's actually being substituted and what we can do about it. We can confirm the suitability of the ratios actually on product labeling and see if people actually understand, because the information is already there. And obviously, like I mentioned previously, to test the effect of substitution as an intervention, study to see the effect on potentially risk factors or health outcomes or just on diet as a whole. Now, when you're thinking of other countries, we know that, to give you an Australian context versus elsewhere, it's very similar, the situation in Australia in terms of overweight and obesity, but it's important to think about dietary patterns, which can quite differ across countries. Adding on to my breakfast cereal blurb, being raised and born in Brazil, every time I go back, I kind of laugh at the breakfast cereal aisle because it's so small. It's nearly non-existent. It's just a one little row or one column section in the supermarket aisle for breakfast cereals. Where in Australia, you have like 2 massive aisles of breakfast cereal options. So it's really important to take cultural perspective into account when discussing and talking about dietary patterns. I'd like to thank my amazing team for their great work on this. I obviously didn't do this by myself, especially Michelle Blumfield, who led most of the manuscript writing and the analysis, Andrew McConnell, who came up with this substitution analysis for us, Dr. Sky Marshall, who provided insights, Tim Casatari and Molly Warner, who assisted with the research, and of course Nestlé Rsearch, who developed the concept of this study and helped with the critically reviewing the manuscripts that we developed. So thank you very much, everyone. All our references are here for those who are interested in some further reading. Thank you.